Hello again and welcome to General Psychology, Psychology 101. And today we're going to be talking about what is psychology. And basically to answer this question, we're going to focus on going through and talking about the history of psychology, how it's evolved and formed over the last few centuries. So to start off with, basically when we talk about psychology, we're talking about the study of different mental processes and different behaviors and how these things interconnect and intertwine. And people have been basically thinking about psychology since people have been, thinking at all. For example, Aristotle, an early philosopher, started basically thinking about the mind and the exact processes that occur in the mind, the exact structures that could be part of the mind, and how they might coincide with different behaviors. And really it was Wilhelm Wundt who basically created the first lab devoted to psychology in 1879. And his focus was on examining the structure of consciousness. How can we understand how people are conscious, how people are actively thinking about their world, other people? And is there some sort of foundation or predictability or structure to how people think about the world? Well, this idea of trying to figure out structure of thought and structure of consciousness led to development of functionalism. And this movement was led by the psychologist William James. And William James, Bill James as some people might call him, has had his hand in a lot of the foundational theories, foundational studies, foundational understandings of psychology. And a lot of his work was influenced on Darwin's work at the time, theory of evolution, trying to understand why different animals, different species behave in the way that they do. The idea that all of these species have these evolutionary or biological goals that are driving their behaviors. Well, basically William James had similar thoughts about the human mind, that it functions in a similar way. We have specific goals, we have specific motives and motivations that are driving our specific thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. Well, again, new thoughts, new theories developed from this idea of functionalism, and behaviorism was formed. And this school of psychology focused primarily on behaviors, specifically observable behaviors. These researchers, so this movement was led by John Watson and B.F. Skinner. These researchers couldn't possibly understand what was going on in another person's mind. They felt that there was no reliable way to measure thoughts or feelings to a certain extent. So they focused on what they could measure, and that is behavior, specific things that people did, that they could see with their own eyes and they could measure in any way, shape, or form. And this was a response to another form of psychology that was around at the time, specifically Gestalt psychology, which focused on more abstract concepts that couldn't necessarily be measured or kind of pinned down using numbers. So these researchers focused on observable behaviors. We'll talk a little bit about, especially John Watson and B.F. Skinner, but a lot of the research conducted in behaviorism actually focused on research with animals, and this kind of encourages a kind of a subtype of behaviorism known as animal psychology. You may or may not be familiar with Ivan Pavlov, but he has one of the quintessential psychology studies, which actually isn't a psychology study at all, but the dog salivating after a ringing bell. So Pavlov specifically conditioned, using different behavioral modification techniques, conditioned a dog to salivate on command, specifically whenever they hear a ringing bell. And we'll talk a little bit later in the quarter about exactly what's happening there. But this was the idea of observing specific behavior. So, for example, observing salivating, or in other situations, observing the pressing of a lever or walking in one certain direction, and using that to basically make assumptions about whether or not animals or people are learning about their environment and what they know about their environment. So kind of taking the behaviors and making certain extrapolations, not too many, but trying to assume what's going on inside someone's head. Well, another school of research, which is probably the most popular or well-known school of research for those individuals who aren't well-versed in psychology, is that of psychoanalysis. And this section of psychology is led by, of course, Sigmund Freud. And a lot of the research on psychoanalysis focuses on the unconscious, focuses on aspects of our mind, aspects of our thoughts that people may not necessarily be aware of. So a lot of the research focuses on, or specifically divides the mind or the conscious into three separate entities: the id, the ego, and the superego. Where the id is primarily driven by desires, unconscious wants, and the ego is driven by how we're supposed to behave in the real world, how we're supposed to interact with other people. A lot of its research focuses on, again, these things that we're not aware of, these motivations that maybe we didn't know we had, things from our past, things from our childhood, interactions or relationships that we have with our parents and our family, and how they might be driving our behaviors, our thoughts, and our feelings. A lot of this research focuses on negative aspects of psychology, trying to explain why negative relationships from our past have led to specific behaviors that people might not want to do, or some ruminating thoughts and negative thoughts that people might have about themselves or others. Response to this was humanistic psychology, led by Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. This focused more on healthy individuals, thriving individuals, people who were happy with who they were for the most part and were living their daily lives in a good mood, basically, in a happy mood. And a lot of this research focused on positivity, focused on helping people reach their full potential in daily life, rather than focusing on a lot of the negative aspects of psychology that Freud and psychoanalysis did. As we progress, we're getting well into the 1900s at this point, getting into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we see the emergence of cognitive psychology. And basically, this is a focus more on combining a lot of the aspects of psychology that focus on, all right, what's going on in the mind, with the behavioral aspects of the more abstract forms of psychology, such as Gestalt psychology or such as psychoanalysis. So basically a combination of psychoanalysis, or more abstract concepts, and more concrete concepts such as behaviorism, and functionalism. And cognitive psychology addresses both the observable and the unobservable. So kind of dips its hand into both of these. And although cognitive psychology does have a lot of science as its foundation, it is still criticized by these behaviorists, these pure behaviorists, that say all you can focus on is behavior. Cognitive psychology takes it a little bit step further and says, well, there are some assumptions that we can make about certain processes that are occurring in the brain, and we can use those to increase our understanding of how it works. And again, moving into the later 1900s, into the 21st century, we see more integration of different areas of psychology. We see a greater move into integrating more scientific ways of measuring psychology, ways of measuring behavior, ways of measuring, for example, brain activity. For example, behavioral neuroscience is a very important field in psychology. Many of you have probably seen an fMRI image where it's kind of a mapping of the brain, and you see certain areas of the brain lit up, which means that they're active. Again, using more hard science, more biology to complement some of the aspects of psychology. We see other areas emerging, such as positive psychology, such as health psychology, such as mainstream psychology, using some psychological phenomenon and applying it to real-world settings. We'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But for the most part, psychology is considered a social science, but its roots are in natural sciences. We have influences from Darwin in biology. We have influences from other aspects of biology, for example, neurobiology. And yes, psychology is often lumped together with other social sciences, such as sociology. But science is at the heart of psychology. Hard science and a lot of these scientific principles are extremely necessary to be able to measure, assess, test, hypothesize, and do all that fun stuff with some of the psychological phenomena that we're interested in. So that's all I have today. We'll be back later with some more content, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks.